Welcome to the second official episode of the ProLabs podcast. On this podcast, we talk about fiber optics, relevant news stories, product overviews, discussions over the best networking solutions, and much more. My name is Jon Eikel, and I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at ProLabs. And joining me here is our co-host, Ray Hagen.
Hi, my name is Ray Hagen. I'm the Global Product Line Manager at ProLabs. For this episode, we're going to discuss how the pandemic is putting an enormous amount of stress on broadband networks right now, as well as the best solutions and innovations for service providers to properly deal with this ongoing issue. So it's a pretty big topic, John. The pandemic's touched every one of our lives. I know it's touched yours and everyone else out there who may be watching. And I often wonder, I certainly am not bandwidth hog in my household. During last spring, during the height of it, my wife was, teaching, and we had, she had Zoom sessions on and off during the day, 2 kids doing distance learning. We weren't doing full streaming, but then, of course, Hamilton comes on Disney Plus, and we're like, all right, we got to get into the streaming game here, considering we were late holdouts. So I was wondering how much bandwidth does a household like mine really, how much stress does someone even as a moderate user put onto a broadband network?
Ray, I think we've come to think of broadband as more of a utility than a convenience or a nice to have. And, in fact, as we sit here conducting this podcast, we're consuming bandwidth. A couple of high definition streams, encoded with MPEG-4 encoding, we're probably chewing up between 10 and 12 megabits per second, across the internet today, executing the recording of this podcast. And so you multiply that by the number of people sitting in your household doing distance learning, whether they're transmitting and receiving or just receiving video content, and suddenly, multiplied by all of the homes in your neighborhood, by all of the neighborhoods in your town, by all of the towns in your state, you start talking about serious amounts of traffic that service provider networks just have never seen before.
Yeah, that's a good point. So, for example, a lot of the service provider networks in the U.S. have just started rolling out, remote PHY, MSOs and the, telcos doing either VDSL2, or maybe they're doing GPON to the home, or just good old-fashioned ADSL. Who knows what else might be out there? So, what are those service providers? What are they having to do to keep up with all this demand?
Yeah, I think we have to look at each of those mediums individually. And the challenges that occur kind of at that access layer of the network. So, the providers that have deployed PON technologies, so passive optical networks, whether it's GPON or XGS 10 gig based PON or 10 gig EPON, they're probably in the least painful situation for the pandemic and the explosion of consumption in comparison to other, access medium technologies. So, by nature, you have a symmetrical or close to symmetrical connection for the end user. You've got a much broader upstream path in GPON. You've got a 1.25 gigabits in the upstream at a minimum, all the way up to 10 gig for larger PON solutions. And these types of video conferencing technologies are just as taxing on the upstream connection as they are on the downstream. And so when you look at other access mediums like DOCSIS, where you have a tremendously robust downstream capable of 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 gigabits per second, but then a very limited upstream that might be only capable of 100 to 200 megabits per second, and a serving group of some number of homes sharing that, that aggregate bandwidth available. DOCSIS networks, for instance, might have a little more stress in the upstream. And DSL, I think, whether it's VDSL or ADSL2, ADSL2 plus, HDSL, there's, I think, every letter of the alphabet version of DSL now. And almost all of them coexist across, telecommunication networks. At the end of the day, those have more limited upstream capabilities, but they're dedicated limited upstream capabilities. So each home has a finite amount of bandwidth available on its twisted pair or bonded twisted pair solution. So the bandwidth constraint for DSL comes from the DSLAM, or the access concentrator northbound into the metro or regional network. And each of these has a challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. You hit the nail there. So regardless of your medium, right? You get back to that concentration point. You get to a bottleneck, right? Either you hit a router somewhere, right? That a switch somewhere, right? That you need to upgrade somewhere beyond the access network. What types of pipes are service providers having to get to those bottlenecks right now? What are the sizes?
Sure. So we know through our SP customers that some of those smaller and older aggregate networks are gigabit or multi-gigabit bonded networks. So some of these DSLAMs and older DSL technologies, service providers are still very much dealing with 1 gigabit access layer connections. When you talk about cable modem terminating systems, or CMTS, the DOCSIS side of cable, the vast majority of those were probably 10 gig going into this year, and service providers find themselves either on a path to upgrade to multiple 10 gigs based on their network infrastructure, or upgrading from multiple 10 gigs to single or multiple 100 gig interfaces as these CMTSs have become more dense, and DOCSIS 3.1 and OFDM gives them that very robust downstream capability. In PON, I think you've got a mixed bag of 10 and 100 gig, depending on the life cycle of the OLT that the service provider is using. But in each case, I think 10 and 100 gig are the prevailing upstream connections from these access layers, with some legacy 1 gig floating around.
Yeah, that's it's interesting because you've got you hear a lot at SCTE last year. The buzz on the show floor was 10 gig, right, into the access layer towards the home, a long way away from that. But just this might be a mini trial run, right, to see exactly how much work needs to be done in the aggregation part of the network up towards the core of how much bandwidth they're really going to need. Because if you give consumers bandwidth, they're going to use it, right? That's pretty obvious right now. I mean, they're not going to go. It's not going to go unused for the most part. Is what we're finding.
The good news is service providers have had a couple of years of video streaming under their belts to get ready for this pandemic event. So, at the end of the day, there's only so many eyeballs in your household, and those eyeballs are either watching TV or they're watching some kind of video conferencing right now, whether it's work or school. Unless you've got a TV playing in the background with no eyeballs watching it, it's unlikely that you've got any new duplicative bandwidth happening in your home. So the SPs have had some time to kind of prepare for the events of today. What I think is not happening anymore is the lack of duplication of consumption. So in traditional service provider networks, you have a daytime bell curve that has a huge consumption during the day. And then you've got a nighttime bell curve of residential traffic that peaks, sometime between the hours of like 7 and midnight. And so all of a sudden now you've got everybody at home, and you don't have that same access and metro breakdown of business and residential traffic you once had. It's all going to the residents. And so that's probably the stress point.
Right. And I think, touching on those stress points, when the pandemic hit, back in March, right, when it became real for everybody, one of the big things was we feel it in all of other points of our life. Right now, why can I only get, like my 16-year-old, why can I only get 2 flavors of Mountain Dew? Why can't I get 10 flavors of Mountain Dew? It's supply chain, right? And service providers are feeling it too. And in terms of, I need to upgrade my CMTS from, I need to add another 10 gig connection. I need to upgrade to 100 gigs. So, one thing that, here at, ProLabs, one thing we've done, tried to show our value is in terms of, being a true supply chain partner in procuring, making sure we have continuous supply for our customers. So, I mean, how important is that to service providers, John, in terms of, having a partner that can really step up to the plate?
Gosh, I think supply chain is a problem everywhere. So in my household, it was the lack of extra flaming hot Cheetos. They simply shut down the manufacturing, and that was a widespread crisis among my home. I think, as a culture, we are inundated with choices and selections. So everybody remembers the great toilet paper shortage of March 2020. And if you look back pre-pandemic, we had 30, no less than 30 choices of toilet paper to buy. And come end of March 2020, I think any of us would have bought any brand we could find on the shelf out of sheer desperation and need. And as we've recovered from the pandemic, or starting to recover, there's a lot of talk that some of these choices won't come back. So fast food restaurants are cut their menus back for the pandemic, and have now said, hey, some of these cuts may be permanent. It's better for our operations, more efficient. It turns out we didn't need 60 types of cheeseburgers at McDonald's, those types of things. We don't need 30 brands of toilet paper. Maybe we only need 2 brands of Mountain Dew. 2 flavors of Mountain Dew. But what can't happen in technology supply chain is sheer unavailability of core technology pieces. So, ProLabs positions itself really well with domestic inventory, both in the United States and the United Kingdom, to serve North and South American customers, as well as our EMEA customers. The taking a very firm and calculated inventory stance on these parts helped us continue delivering through the pandemic to our service provider partners. They don't often have the choice of changing or mixing technologies. They have an install base that they must conform to. And so I think as we worked with our customers and our distribution partners, we certainly know what the trend lines look like. We know what purchasing rhythms look like from service providers. And as we saw the pandemic coming, I think we were able to execute on our very diverse supply chain that includes quite a few nations globally, to ensure our inventory position was healthy and that we continued shipping without interruption. And in fact, we were able to keep some of these tier 1 service providers, tier 2 service providers alive and well and healthy, throughout the pandemic.
Yeah, that was the thing. It was just quite amazing to kind of, as we're powering through this, to understand how important that is, right? To keep on and not have to worry about things running out for our customers, right? We were able to keep on pumping out transceivers, with minimal concern there that we could continue doing it. So that I think that was pretty gratifying us as employees, helping out our service provider customers who are fulfilling very important obligations in our country right now, in our society. So,
I think the size of our company, the fact that we're the largest compatible transceiver vendor, on the planet, allowed us to continue seamless operations. So we had the physical real estate to execute safe social distancing in our production factory very, very quickly. We were able to spin up additional shifts and have the safety mechanisms in place to keep production moving, which was absolutely critical as an essential business. And to your point, I'm proud to be part of that team. We continue to operate under those safety and distancing mechanisms with great care.
Yeah, absolutely. I know, you mentioned about things going away, from the pandemic, but there's some new things, right, that are going to be part of our life as we move on, right? Having Zoom meetings or other meetings, with instead of meeting in person, and we find out, hey, you know what, that works pretty well. Why don't we just do that for some things, and other things, we can't wait to get back and meet with people. But as far as service providers in their network, what are some of the new trends that are going to come out of this pandemic that, are going to be things that they're going to need to do move forward? We talk about the core a lot. We focused on building the layers of the network from the home, centralizing it. So what direction are service providers going to really go forward with here from this pandemic, understanding what they know now? Sure.
I think there's, this pandemic and the response with video consumption, candidly, and distance learning and distance meeting is preparing the service providers for what was an inevitable increase anyway. So we know that 8K video streaming is coming. We know that self-driving cars and artificial intelligence continues to boom and blossom, and that technology continues to mature. Almost everyone has some type of artificial intelligence in their home, whether it's an Alexa-enabled device or Apple's HomeKit or Google Home. at least half a dozen others that are prevalent in the marketplace. All of those things are consuming more and more bandwidth. So I think the pandemic helped the service providers prepare for what was inevitable anyway, and maybe it accelerated some of those upgrades and decisions. The fact is, if we could have predicted this pandemic 3 or 4 years ago, service providers probably would have built different networks. Hindsight is always 20/20, but I think what we've seen across the service provider industry, whether it was the DSL provider or the DOCSIS cable provider or the PON provider, each of them have developed and executed a plan of attack, whether it's serving group splitting and serving group segmentation, or technology upgrades in DSL, or pushing that DSLAM closer to the customer. Serving group splitting or PON splitting is just as relevant in the PON world. I think the SPs are really keen on watching those trends. They've faced this issue before. Peer-to-peer sharing killed service provider networks years ago, and then Netflix came along and killed service provider networks, and then 4,000 other streaming services came along and killed service provider networks. Having come from that background, I can tell you, they've got some amazing engineering folks, and they've got people looking at these technologies every day, day in and day out, preparing themselves for what looks next. This might not have been one anybody predicted, but there were plenty of other drivers that had them looking forward into their networks anyway.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So, unfortunately, there's no real end in sight of the pandemic, and at least as of today, right? What we look at what they're going to need to do for the core, I mean, is 400 gig going to happen this year, John, or is it going to be something that's going to be delayed next year to help kind of be that final choke point release for everything we're seeing?
I think that's a mixed bag depending on what layer of the network we're referring to and who the provider is. So the pandemic has stressed service provider resources, not just in terms of having to learn to work from home themselves, where customer service centers are no longer staffed with hundreds or thousands of agents, but all the way to engineering resources and lab qualification. So those 400 gig platforms were just becoming market prevalent at the early part of this year. So depending on when they made it into the service providers' labs for integration and qualification, and when those labs may have closed or been frozen because of pandemic risk, 400 gig may not make it to the service provider networks in large volume this year. Now that's not to say there won't be any, but if you were a service provider who needed to add bandwidth quickly to an existing platform, it might be easier just to go add more 10 or 100 gig interfaces and forego the 400 gig push because of the complexities around getting new equipment qualified, getting it deployed, getting people out in the field to get these new platforms installed. So we're certainly seeing some uptick in 400 gig sales in terms of transceivers. Lots of companies are qualifying 400 gig right now, but I can't say that it's a super high volume ship item right now. I think 100 gig has certainly exploded in the last 6 months.
Absolutely. Where I think the 400 gig, is really where it started, right, and it's continued to build, is actually in the cloud service providers who are actually the back end for all this fun stuff we're dealing right now with video conferencing and all the hosted applications. I mean, those are the guys who are and the gals and the other folks who are we're really making 400 gig happen right now in the market. And yeah.
Yep, I think we're going to see 400 gig. I'm really proud that we have a full complement and catalog of 400 gig solutions. As a compatible transceiver supplier, I can say we're ready. We're supplying in test to dozens and dozens of service provider and data center customers. I expect towards the end of this year and into the capital spending season of next year, we'll see a significant uptick in 400 gig volume. And right now we have products ready and waiting.
Excellent.
Ray, I wanted to get your thoughts on kind of what comes after 400 gig. So I know we talk about 800 and the next generation. We've always seen this adoption and then plateau and then a new adoption. What are your thoughts on what's beyond 400 gig?
Well, the first thing that's on deck is 800 gig, and there's been some consternation in the industry. What's it going to look like? Is it going to be transceivers? Is it going to be chip on board? And I think every time there's a new data rate, it's going to be chip on board, and then all of a sudden, that doesn't fit real well for everybody's market, because you can't have a board and then just have it be limited to short reach or long reach or whatever you're going to do. So really, transceivers are, guess what? 800 gig is going to have transceivers. It's going to happen. And so they'll be looking at new things like the OSFP form factor. CFP2 may hang around and be part of the 800 gig revolution. So there'll be some big things coming out. I think, what we're hearing in the industry is, it was going to be in 21 that you'd start to really get talk about it. And, it might be pushed out to 22, I think, before you really see it.
Because of pandemic, you think?
Yeah, the whole cycle you just talked about with 400 gig, it's going to be the same cycle where it's just, I think 400 gig isn't even a thing yet for the most part in a lot of networks. And 800 gig, is going to be certain networks, right, are going to need it, and they're going to need it soon. Not they wish it were here today. But, again, like everything, silicon has to be formed, standards have to be created, and, the OEMs have to build their board designs around a technology. So probably looking at 22 before that really takes off or starts to become deployed.
Hey, Ray, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, folks, that's going to do it for this episode. I want to thank you for listening in. Please follow us on whatever podcast platform you're listening to us on, and also subscribe to the ProLabs YouTube channel if you want to watch the video version of this podcast instead.
Yeah, for any questions about ProLabs or any of our products and solutions, please visit our website at prolabs.com. Thanks again, and we'll see you at the next episode.